In December 1944, a German soldier crawling through an abandoned American foxhole found something his own army had almost stopped believing in. Heat. Not from a fire, not from a stove, from a dented mess tin. The stew inside was still warm. Around him, the Ardennes forest was frozen hard. German units were short of fuel, short of trucks, short of medicine, short of sleep, and very often, short of food. A German infantryman in that winter might spend a day on black bread, thin soup, ersatz coffee, and whatever he could steal from a cellar before the artillery started again. He had been told he belonged to the hardest army in Europe. Then he crossed into an American position and found hot beef, potatoes, vegetables, white bread, and coffee that had reached men who were being shelled only an hour earlier. That was not comfort. That was evidence. Because the Americans were not just bringing more tanks. They were not just bringing more aircraft. They were bringing the different kind of war. A war where even dinner moved on wheels. And to German officers staring at captured U.S. food containers, the question was humiliatingly simple. How were they doing this? How was an army in the middle of combat delivering hot meals to riflemen in foxholes, while the Wehrmacht, with all its slogans about discipline and sacrifice, could barely keep its own men fed? The answer was not bravery. It was not luck. And it was not some secret recipe. It was gasoline, steel, standardization, and a little field range the Germans never learned to respect. To understand why this was so devastating, you have to start with the German kitchen. The Wehrmacht still depended on a system that felt modern only on paper. Its famous field kitchen, the Gulaschkanone, the goulash cannon, was basically a rolling boiler. It could cook stew for a company. It could be pulled down roads. It could feed men if the roads were clear, if the horses survived, if wood could be found, if the kitchen could stop long enough to cook, and if nobody noticed the smoke. That was a lot of ifs. By 1944, every one of them was turning against Germany. The goulash cannon was heavy. It was slow. It needed wood or coal. It needed horses. It needed time. And once it started cooking, it announced itself to the sky. On the Western Front, that mattered. American and British fighter bombers hunted roads, crossroads, bridges, wagons, trucks, and anything that looked like supply movement. A field kitchen that stopped beside a tree line and began breathing smoke into the cold air was no longer a kitchen. It was a target marker. So German cooks often prepared food far behind the line, loaded it into containers, and tried to move it forward through mud, snow, traffic jams, shell fire, broken roads, and exhausted men. By the time the food reached the front, if it reached the front, it was often cold. If the carriers were hit, it never arrived. If the horses collapsed, it never moved. If the unit retreated too quickly, the meal belonged to nobody. And as German logistics collapsed, food became less of a service and more of a rumor. Soldiers wrote about bread the way prisoners write about freedom. Men traded cigarettes for potatoes. Units slaughtered horses because the animals were more useful as meat than transport. Kitchens that should have fed companies became stranded behind roads that no longer existed as roads. The Wehrmacht could still put elite formations into a counterattack, but it could not reliably put hot soup into their stomachs. That is the part the myth of German efficiency usually hides. A military system can look brilliant at the point of attack and still be dying behind it. The Americans built the opposite kind of machine. Their Quartermaster Corps treated food as a battlefield system, not as charity, not as morale decoration, as fuel. If a rifle company needed ammunition, the army designed a way to move ammunition. If a tank needed gasoline, the army designed a way to move gasoline. If an infantryman needed hot calories before he was ordered back into the trees, the army designed a way to move those too. At the center of that system was the M1937 field range, It did not look heroic. It did not look like a weapon. It looked like equipment a cook would curse at before sunrise. But it solved the exact problems that were destroying the German kitchen. The M1937 burned gasoline. Not wood. Not coal. Not whatever could be chopped out of a frozen forest. Gasoline. The same basic lifeblood already pouring through the American army in drums, cans, tankers, trucks, jeeps, generators, and repair depots. That single choice mattered enormously. The Germans had to feed the kitchen before the kitchen could feed the men. The Americans plugged the kitchen into a fuel chain that already existed. The M1937 was pressurized, rugged, repairable, portable, and hot enough to cook fast. It could be used as a burner or arranged for baking. It did not need to sit for hours under a visible smoke column. It could be packed, moved, fixed, fueled, and fired again by men who understood machinery as much as cooking. American cooks were not treated as rear area decoration. In practice, they were mobile technicians with ladles. The kitchen itself usually rode on a 2.5-ton truck. That truck carried stoves, rations, water, utensils, fuel, and insulated containers. It could move at the speed of the motorized army. It could pull out before dawn, halt behind the line, cook fast, load the meal, and push the food forward by jeep. That was the key. The kitchen did not need to sit in the foxhole. The heat did. Hot food could be cooked several miles back, sealed into double-walled containers, lashed into jeeps, and run forward to companies under pressure. The last mile might be dangerous. It might be on foot. It might involve shell bursts and frozen mud, and a cook swearing as he carried coffee through the dark. But the system made the attempt possible. And because the system was decentralized at company level, one failure did not break the entire army. If a German field kitchen was lost, a whole unit could go hungry. If an American truck was delayed, neighboring units, reserve kitchens, supply dumps, and motor pools could help patch the gap. This was not elegance. It was redundancy. The kind of ugly, practical abundance Germany could no longer imitate. For a German soldier, the difference felt impossible, because it was bigger than food. A hot American meal represented all the things Germany was running out of at once: fuel, rubber, engines, cooks, cans, containers, road control, air superiority, industrial depth. The time and confidence to believe a frightened infantryman was worth feeding well. That last part mattered. The U.S. Army understood that a hot meal could do what a speech could not. It could tell a man, without saying a word, that the machine behind him still existed. A paper order could tell him to hold the line. A general could tell him his sacrifice mattered. But a cup of hot coffee in a frozen foxhole told him something more immediate. You have not been forgotten. During the Battle of the Bulge, American units were surrounded, cut off, shelled, frozen, and exhausted. Some went days under brutal conditions. Not every man received hot food. Not every run got through. War ruined plans every hour. But the American system kept trying. Jeep drivers pushed through snow. Cooks worked under blackout conditions. Quartermaster units fought mud, congestion, confusion, and German pressure just to keep calories moving. And when hot food did arrive, it changed the air around men. It gave them a few minutes where the war became smaller than a spoon, a cup, and steam rising in the dark. For the Germans watching from the other side, this was corrosive. A propaganda leaflet could be dismissed, an artillery barrage could be answered, a tank could be blamed on factories, but a hot meal in the hands of an enemy private was harder to explain away. It suggested not merely that America was rich, it suggested America had turned richness into procedure. That was the nightmare. The Wehrmacht had built its identity around endurance, obedience, and tactical excellence. But by late 1944, German soldiers were often being asked to solve industrial problems with personal suffering. No truck, march harder. No fuel, wait longer. No food, endure more. No horses, drag it yourself. The American answer was colder, less romantic, and far more dangerous. Build more trucks, standardize the fuel, train the cooks, insulate the containers, move the kitchen, feed the rifleman before he breaks. One army demanded that hunger prove loyalty. The other treated hunger as a logistical defect. That difference reached beyond the stomach. It shaped morale, recovery, discipline, and the ability to fight tomorrow after being terrified today. A starving soldier can still be brave. Many German soldiers were. A starving soldier can still attack. Many did. But hunger charges interest. It slows decisions. It weakens hands. It makes cold more vicious. It turns fear into exhaustion, and exhaustion into surrender. It fills the mind with bread, when the mind should be watching the tree line. By the end of the war, surrendering German troops often stared at American food as if they had crossed into another economy, not just another army. They saw canned meat stacked casually, coffee served as routine, bread that was not black with substitutes, trucks used for meals when German units were lucky to get trucks for ammunition. And in that moment, the battlefield revealed the truth more clearly than any map. Germany had tried to win a modern war with a logistics system still chained to horses, smoke, scarcity, and improvisation. America had taken the most ordinary human need in war and industrialized it. Not glamorously. Completely. The M1937 field range did not win World War II by itself. No stove wins a war. But it showed the kind of country the German army was actually fighting. A country that could build bombers and bake bread. A country that could ship tanks across oceans and still think about coffee. A country that understood a front line was not just a place where bullets were fired. It was a place where men had to be kept alive long enough, warm enough, and fed enough to fire back. That is why the hot meal mattered. It was not a luxury at the edge of combat. It was the visible steam of an invisible system. The Germans kept looking for a trick, because they could still imagine courage, hardship, and sacrifice. What they could not imagine was abundance made disciplined. Germany built rockets to terrify cities. America built a stove, a truck, a fuel chain, and a delivery system that kept terrified men fed. And in the frozen foxholes of 1944, that warm mess tin was not just dinner. It was the verdict. The first warning was not the bomb. It was the smell. A Japanese dive bomber had come in low over the gray water, so low that the sailors on the afterdeck saw the exhaust stains along its cowling before they saw the pilot's face. It clipped the carrier's island, tore open one wing, and slammed sideways across the crash net without exploding. The bomb was still under the belly. The pilot was dead. And from the split-wing tank, a pale stream of aviation gasoline began running down the deck. Chief Bosun's mate Frank Malloy was the first man close enough to catch it. He expected the usual sting of fuel. Dirty, sharp, heavy with refinery bite. But this did not smell like battlefield gasoline. It smelled too clean, like hospital solvent, like a laboratory cabinet, like something a chemist would label before he would burn it. Malloy grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a dented wardroom coffee urn, and shoved it under the leak. By the time the damaged crew pushed the wreckage over the side, the urn held a little less than 3 gallons of enemy fuel. Not enough to power anything. Enough to frighten the Pacific Fleet. Because 2 days later, that coffee urn was sitting on a steel bench inside a Navy petroleum lab at Pearl Harbor. and the first man who opened it did not ask where the plane had come from. He asked one question: why does Japanese fuel smell cleaner than ours? By April 1945, the answer should have been impossible. Japan was supposed to be starving for fuel. American submarines had cut the tanker routes from the south. Bombers had been tearing at refineries. Pilots were being sent into the air with less training, less maintenance, and less chance of coming home. Every intelligence summary said the same thing in different words. Japan could still fight, but its aviation fuel system was collapsing. That was the assumption. Then Commander Nathan Rowe watched a glass hydrometer float in the enemy sample and saw a number that did not belong in a dying fuel program. American 100-octane combat gasoline usually sat near 0.695 specific gravity at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, low enough to indicate a clean, high-performance blend. A degraded fuel, one stretched with heavy fractions or poor substitutes, should read higher. 0.71, 0.72, sometimes worse. The Japanese sample read 0.692. Rowe stared at the column. He made the technician run it again. 0.692. A second bottle, filled from the same urn, read 0.691. That meant the fuel from a suicide aircraft was not heavier. It was lighter, cleaner, more tightly refined than the control sample sitting beside it. For a moment, nobody in the lab spoke. Then Rowe said, "Pull the Navy fuel from storage. Same test, same temperature." The American sample came back within specification. Good fuel, wartime fuel, the kind that had helped carry Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, Liberators, and B-29s across half the world. But it was not cleaner than the Japanese fuel in the coffee urn. That was the first crack in the story the Navy thought it understood. The second crack came from the chromatograph. Aviation gasoline is not just gasoline. It is a controlled argument between chemistry and violence. Inside a combat engine, fuel has to burn hard without detonating too early. If it detonates too early, the engine knocks. If the engine knocks badly enough under combat power, pistons can crack, bearings can hammer themselves apart, and an aircraft that still has wings becomes a falling object. That is why 100-octane fuel mattered. It let engines take more boost, more manifold pressure, more emergency power when the fight had no room left for caution. The United States had spent years and an industrial fortune building the refining system to make that fuel by the oceanful. Cracking units, alkylation plants, tetraethyl lead blending, quality control, tank farms, pipelines, the whole hidden empire behind a fighter pilot pushing the throttle past the safe mark. Japan was not supposed to have anything comparable left. Not in quantity, not at quality, not in April 1945, and certainly not for aircraft that were never meant to return. That was what made the coffee urn dangerous. A kamikaze was not a prestige aircraft. It was a one-way weapon. If a nation is truly running out of refined aviation fuel, it does not pour its best gasoline into a machine it expects to lose in 10 minutes. It saves that fuel for interceptors, for night fighters, for the few veteran pilots still defending the home islands. War logistics can be cruel, but they are rarely irrational. So if the fuel in that urn was elite, one of two things had to be true. Either American intelligence had underestimated what Japan could still refine, or Japan had decided that the suicide program deserved its best chemistry. Neither answer was comforting. Lieutenant Ruth Avery ran the fraction analysis just after midnight. The lab windows were blacked out. The fans were off because the vibration spoiled readings. A cup of coffee went cold beside the instrument while the first trace crawled across the paper. Avery had expected a rough blend. A little high-performance stock, a little stretched base gasoline, a little desperation hidden inside the numbers. Instead, the chart showed a fuel blended with discipline, a high isooctane fraction, clean alkylate, low contamination, no obvious pine root extender, no heavy smear of panic chemistry. It looked less like a country scraping barrels and more like a country rationing excellence. Rowe read the trace twice. Then he asked the question that would keep him in the lab until morning. Where are they getting the alkylate? Alkylate was the prize. In wartime aviation gasoline, it was one of the cleanest ways to get high octane without turning the fuel into a dirty compromise. But making it was not simple. It required specialized vessels, controlled temperature, dangerous acid catalysts, trained operators, and enough industrial confidence to reject a bad batch, even when every gallon mattered. That last part mattered most. A starving fuel system does not throw away imperfect gasoline. It uses it. It labels it good enough. It sends it forward and hopes the engine holds. The Japanese sample had not been treated that way. It had been trimmed, corrected, finished. At 2 a.m, Avery produced the first catalyst fingerprint. The pattern did not match the simpler sulfuric acid process the Americans expected from a resource-constrained plant. It matched hydrofluoric acid alkylation. The harder route, the cleaner route, the route associated with the best allied high-performance fuel units. Rowe wrote only 4 words in the margin of the worksheet: not emergency production. The third test was the one no one could argue away. Composition could imply performance. Density could suggest it. But octane had to be measured under load. The sample was fed into a standardized test engine, a single-cylinder machine built to knock on command and tell the truth about fuel. The American control fuel ran as expected, a lean mixture rating just over 100. A rich mixture performance number in the low 130s, exactly what a frontline aircraft wanted. Then the Japanese fuel went in. The needle climbed. The engine held. The knock curve stayed flat longer than it should have. The first run gave a rich mixture performance number just under 140. The second run came back within a hair of it. Not a miracle, not magic, just chemistry doing its work. But in an air battle, that difference could mean a few more seconds of full emergency power, a steeper final dive, a tighter correction before impact, an engine that did not cough during the only run that mattered. The fuel was part of the weapon. That was the turn. Not simply that Japan still had good gasoline. That would have been bad enough. The real discovery was colder. The suicide aircraft were not being fueled with leftovers. They were being supplied as priority weapons, with carefully finished fuel designed to keep an engine alive right up to the moment the aircraft was destroyed. A one-way pilot did not need fuel for the trip home. But he did need enough reliable power to reach the ship. Enough anti-knock margin to dive at full throttle. Enough volatility control to start cleanly in coastal weather and run hard over open water. Enough chemical precision that the last mechanical failure would not happen 10 seconds before impact. That changed how the Navy looked at the attacks. It meant the kamikaze was not only a human decision, it was a logistics decision, a refinery decision, a quality control decision. Somewhere in Japan, chemists and plant operators were feeding the suicide campaign as deliberately as armorers fitted the bombs. By the 4th day, the lead analysis came back. Tetraethyl lead was the anti-knock additive that made much of wartime high-octane fuel possible. Too little, and the engine knocked. Too much, and the spark plugs fouled, valves suffered, deposits formed, and reliability collapsed. The art was not simply adding lead. The art was stopping at the edge. The Japanese sample measured 4 milliliters per U.S. gallon, exactly at the practical ceiling used for high-grade aviation fuel. Not roughly, not close, not safely under. 4. Avery checked the titration. A second technician checked her work. Rowe ordered a third run from an unopened bottle. 4 again. He did not smile. He looked tired. Because precision like that meant paperwork. It meant calibration. It meant inspection stations. It meant a system still organized enough to care about the last decimal point. A broken industry does not behave that way. A broken industry pours, prays, and ships. This industry was still measuring. On the 5th day, the lab stopped treating the sample as an oddity and started treating it as intelligence. The chemists wrote down what the fuel itself implied. Not what pilots had reported. Not what prisoners had guessed. Not what old maps showed. What the molecules said. The fuel suggested a small but capable production stream. Not mass volume, not American volume. Something narrower, protected, prioritized, technically sophisticated. High-grade alkylate blended with limited conventional stocks, leaded to the ceiling, finished with care, and allocated to missions where a single engine failure could mean the difference between a splash in the water and a burning hole in a carrier deck. Rowe summarized it in one sentence during the morning briefing. They are not drowning in fuel. Then he corrected himself. They are choosing where the clean fuel goes. That sentence moved faster than the report. By evening, the petroleum lab's findings were being compared against aerial photographs, prisoner interrogations, bomb damage surveys, and signals fragments from the inland sea. The pattern began to narrow. Certain plants that had been listed as low-value coal processing sites were suddenly worth another look. A facility near Uve. Smaller units near chemical works that had been filed under fertilizer, solvents, or synthetic byproducts. Industrial sites that did not look like the great American refining complexes because they did not need to. They were not trying to feed an empire of aircraft. They were feeding a priority list. Interceptors, special attack units, aircraft whose missions were selected, briefed, fueled, and launched with the knowledge that they would spend everything in one final burn. That made the production small, but not unimportant. A gallon of that fuel did not need to serve a campaign for months. It needed to carry one aircraft through the last minutes of its life. And in that narrow role, quality mattered more than volume. The target officers did not like chemical uncertainty. They liked shipyards, airfields, bridges, factories you could see clearly from altitude. But the chemistry report changed the argument. A plant that produced only a trickle of high-grade aviation components might be more dangerous than its size suggested, because that trickle was going straight into the aircraft the fleet feared most.